Hello, and welcome to The Psychology of Murder, a podcast by Keisha Wilson. If you know me, you know I love two things, psychology and true crime. More specifically, murder. I've spent too many hours of my life consuming all things true crime, including, but not limited to, podcasts, documentaries, and YouTube videos. Podcasting is actually something I've been wanting to do for quite a while, and hence, the Psychology of Murder podcast was born. Throughout this podcast, I intend on informing you, the masses, about the connections and relationship between psychology and murder. For this first episode, I'm going to go over the definition of a psychopath, as well as dive into the signs and symptoms of it. You'll notice there's a lot of overlap between murder and psychopathy. My information for this episode will be coming from multiple online sources that will be listed in the description, as well as input from my education in psychology and the DSM-5. So, starting off, we should define a psychopath. Did you know there's not actually a DSM-5 diagnosis for psychopathy? Instead, it's known as Antisocial Personality Disorder, or ASPD for short. For the purposes of this podcast, I will be referring to ASPD as the diagnosis of a psychopath, even though that's not technically correct. I just think it simplifies it a little bit. Now, it is important to note here that in this context, antisocial does not always mean that these people are going to be reserved or withdrawn from people or society. In psychology, it means that someone goes against society, or literally antisocial, someone who goes against the grain, so to speak. As we get into the definitions of these disorders, I am going to be reading these psychological diagnosis criteria straight from the DSM-5 in order to be as accurate as possible. Obviously, I do not take any credit for these definitions. These are coming straight from the DSM-5, which is published and distributed by the American Psychological Association. Now, let's get into the definition of antisocial personality disorder as defined by the DSM-5. Criterion A. Disregard for and violation of others' rights since the age of 15, as indicated by one of the 7 subfeatures. Number 1, failure to obey laws and norms by engaging in behavior which results in criminal arrest or would warrant criminal arrest. Number 2, lying, deception, and manipulation for profit or self-amusement. Number 3, impulsive behavior. Number 4, irritability and aggression, manifested as frequent assaults of others or engages in fighting. Number 5, blatantly disregards safety of self and others. Number 6, a pattern of irresponsibility. And number 7, a lack of remorse for actions. The other diagnostic criterion are B, the person is at least the age of 18. C, conduct disorder was present by history before age of 15, which I will be going into the definition of conduct disorder later in this podcast. And D, the antisocial behavior does not occur in the context of schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. Now, the term psychopath is something that is thrown around a lot today, especially in the world of true crime. But antisocial personality disorder is not a very prevalent condition. In fact, it is estimated that the prevalence of ASPD is between 0.02% and 3.3%. The DSM-5 also discusses some risk factors for developing ASPD. If you have a first-degree biological relative who has the disorder, there is a much higher likelihood that you will develop the disorder yourself. In addition, being male increases your chances. For some reason, there is a higher prevalence in the male population than the female population. If you're familiar with psychology or have taken intro to psych at some point, you have more than likely heard of the nature versus nurture debate. So, where does psychopathy fall in that debate? The short answer is we don't really know. As you can tell by the risk factors, there is at least some component that could be attributed to nature, such as having a first-degree relative that has the condition or being biologically male. But you do have those cases where a female who doesn't have a family history of psychopathy end up developing this disorder, potentially because they have a traumatic childhood, which would be attributed to nurture. Now let's get into some of the signs and symptoms of psychopathy in everyday life. These people have the inability to distinguish between right and wrong. They often don't believe that there is anything wrong with their behavior. There is a tendency to lie often. There is a disregard towards safety and responsibility. They often manipulate and hurt others. They have difficulty showing remorse or empathy, and they have a tendency to take risks and reckless behavior. They also have a lack of deep emotional connection and can frequently have superficial charm. Ted Bundy, anyone? Now, as I had mentioned previously, you cannot be diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder until you are at least the age of 18. However, there do seem to be some common trends in childhood of some warning signs that could potentially indicate a future diagnosis of ASPD, and I'll go over some of those now. First of all, you have hurting others, or more specifically, hurting animals. Jeffrey Dahmer, H.H. Holmes are great examples of this. They spend a lot of time in their childhood killing and dismembering animals. Oftentimes it starts smaller with, maybe some mice or some squirrels, but can escalate into small pets such as cats and dogs. And based on some interviews with serial killers such as Jeffrey Dahmer, I really think this stems from a sense of morbid curiosity about the body and how it works, which I find kind of interesting. These next two warning signs I feel are a little bit weak, and I'll explain why. So next we have stealing for pleasure, which, I feel like kids will be kids. I feel like that's not a very damning warning sign. Also, we have lack of emotional response, which I also have issues with because there is not one way. There's not a guidebook or a handbook on how to emotionally respond to things. I feel like in the true crime world, this can lead to some wrongful convictions whenever a family member doesn't have the correct response to being told that a loved one has been murdered, or if they're acting strange in interrogation. That's not something that is going to prove or disprove their guilt. So I have an issue with that, but that's just me personally. Next, we have fire starting, which is something you will also see in future arsonists. And finally, I don't want to say this is my favorite one, but I find it the most interesting because it is prolonged bedwetting. I am really curious as to how something psychological such as antisocial personality disorder can manifest itself in something so physiological such as bedwetting and until a later age. And I find that very interesting, and I would like to do more research on that, but I'm not sure how much research there actually is about that. Now, getting into the more statistical side of things, as I had already mentioned, ASPD is more common in men than women. But people with ASPD also have higher mortality rates because of their reckless behavior. They don't have a very good sense of a conscience or one at all. They don't have that self-preserving voice in the back of their head that tells them not to do dumb things. So that makes sense. Also, as I had previously mentioned, you have to be 18 and older in order to be officially diagnosed with this. But you can show signs of conduct disorder or oppositional defiant disorder as early as age 11, which can be an early indicator for ASPD. And I'm going to go over the definitions of these now, and you will see a lot of overlap between these three diagnoses. Starting out with conduct disorder, we have criterion A, a repetitive and persistent pattern of behavior in which the basic rights of others or major age-appropriate societal norms or rules are violated, as manifested by the presence of at least 3 of the following 15 criteria in the past 12 months from any of the categories below, with at least 1 criterion present in the past 6 months. We've got a couple different categories here. So first off, we're starting with aggression to people and animals. Number 1, often bullies, threatens, or intimidates others. Number 2, often initiates physical fights. Number 3, has used a weapon that can cause serious physical harm to others. For example, a bat, a brick, a broken bottle, a knife, or a gun. Number 4, has been physically cruel to people. Number 5, has been physically cruel to animals. Number 6, has stolen while confronting a victim, for example, mugging, purse snatching, extortion, or armed robbery. Number 7, has forced someone into sexual activity. The next category we have is destruction of property. Number 8 has deliberately engaged in fire setting with the intention of causing serious damage. Number 9 has deliberately destroyed others' property other than by fire setting. Next, we have deceitfulness or theft. Number 10 has broken into someone else's home, building, or car. Number 11 often lies to obtain goods or favors or to avoid obligations, for example, conning others. Number 12 has stolen items of non-trivial value without confronting a victim, for example, shoplifting, but without breaking and entering, or forgery. Serious violations of rules. 13 often stays out at night despite parental prohibitions, beginning before the age of 13 years old. Number 14 has run away from home overnight at least twice while living in the parental or parental surrogate home, or once without returning for a lengthy period. And number 15 is often truant from school beginning before the age of 13 years. Criterion B is the disturbance in behavior causes clinically significant impairment in social, academic, or occupational functioning. And criterion C, if the individual is 18 years or older, criteria are not met for antisocial personality disorder. Next up, we've got oppositional defiant disorder. Criterion A pattern of angry or irritable mood, argumentative or defiant behavior, or vindictiveness lasting at least 6 months as evidenced by at least 4 symptoms from any of the following categories, and exhibited during interaction with at least one individual who is not a sibling. Starting off with the category of angry or irritable mood, we have number 1, often loses temper. Number 2 is often touchy or easily annoyed. 3 is often angry and resentful. Next, we have argumentative or defiant behavior. Number 4 often argues with authority figures, or, for children and adolescents, with adults. Number 5 often actively defies or refuses to comply with requests from authority figures or with rules. Number 6 often deliberately annoys others. And number 7 often blames others for his or her mistakes or behavior. Next, we have vindictiveness, which has a very long and specific definition, so bear with me. Number 8 has been spiteful or vindictive at least twice within the past 6 months. Note, the persistence and frequency of these behaviors should be used to distinguish a behavior that is within normal limits from a behavior that is symptomatic. For children younger than 5 years, the behavior should occur on most days for a period of at least 6 months unless otherwise noted. For individuals 5 years or older, the behavior should occur at least once per week for at least 6 months unless otherwise noted. While these frequency criteria provide guidance on a minimal level of frequency to define symptoms, other factors should be considered, such as whether the frequency and intensity of the behaviors are outside a range that is normative for the individual's developmental level, gender, and culture. B. The disturbance in behavior is associated with distress in the individual or others in his or her immediate social context, for example, family, peer groups, or work colleagues, or it impacts negatively on social, educational, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. These behaviors do not occur exclusively during the course of a psychotic, substance use, depressive, or bipolar disorder. Also, the criteria are not met for disruptive mood dysregulation disorder. I just have to note here that just because someone has a diagnosis of conduct disorder or oppositional defiant disorder, it does not mean that these people are for sure going to grow up and become antisocial. I have known people with these diagnoses and they have turned out just fine. They have not turned into psychopaths, they have not turned into serial killers. So please do not make any assumptions about people with these disorders. When I was doing my research for this episode, I found on a website, I believe it was healthline.com, which take that for what it's worth, but they said that antisocial personality disorder is a chronic condition, obviously, that seems to improve with age. Now, I am not sure where they got this information, what basis they have to make this claim. I am very curious to know because that is something I have never heard anywhere else, but I just thought I would throw that in there, so take that what it's worth. I do have to say, though, if they are strictly basing that off of the idea that the older you get, the less of the population has this disorder, we already talked about how people with ASPD have a higher mortality rate and they die at a younger age. So if that's what they're basing that on, that is an absolute fallacy and is not true. But just had to point that out. Another debate we frequently have in the true crime psychology world is the difference between a psychopath and a sociopath. Those are both words that we hear thrown around a lot, but nobody really seems to know the difference. You hear the same definition for both words in different contexts, so it can get kind of confusing. So, as a psychology student and now graduate, I have asked all of my psychology professors their opinion on this, and they all agreed that there is no clinical difference between a psychopath and a sociopath. Essentially, they are the same thing. Clinically, there is no difference. As I had said, a psychopath is not something that is defined in the DSM-5, nor is a sociopath. So, for all intents and purposes, they are the same thing. Now, as one final note before we end today, I would just like to reiterate that just because someone has antisocial personality disorder, just because someone is a, quote, psychopath, it does not mean that they are a murderer, it does not mean that they are a serial killer, and it does not mean that they are a bad person. In fact, you can often find people with antisocial personality disorder at the heads of companies, either as a CEO or a CFO. It is something that they can use their, quote, psychopathic traits to move further in the field faster than other people, and it makes them a great asset to the competitive job market. Thank you for listening to the Psychology of Murder podcast. This first episode is a little short, but this is just the beginning. I hope you enjoyed our time together and will be returning for future episodes. If you have suggestions for topics you would like me to cover in the future, please reach out and let me know. I'll hear you later.